From indigenous nations to global superpower, America's story unfolds like no other. What transformed scattered colonies into history's most influential nation? Journey through blood-soaked battlefields where freedom was born. Witness slavery's brutal chains shatter in civil war, and stand in awe as immigrants build skyscrapers reaching for impossible dreams. Experience the crash of economic collapse, the triumph of world wars, and a nation's painful struggle to live up to its founding ideals. The American experiment, constantly tested, frequently wounded, yet stubbornly resilient, continues to evolve before our eyes. Discover how a radical idea of self-government became the force that shaped our modern world. Ice cracked like thunder as glaciers surrendered to a warming world. In the far reaches of Siberia, where mammoth herds roamed and hunters stitched furs by firelight, families set their eyes on a horizon they had never crossed. Before them lay Beringia, a frozen bridge of tundra and steppe, stretching toward a continent no human had yet named. Winds howled across that expanse, carrying the cries of wolves and the beating wings of migrating birds, but also the footfalls of the first peoples who would become the ancestors of nations without number. They came not as conquerors, but as wanderers. Each step followed game, each mile driven by hunger, hope, and the restless pull of discovery. Across generations, their paths carved invisible trails over icebound plains, and into a world so vast it seemed endless. What began as migration became destiny. When the ice receded and seas swallowed Beringia, their descendants were already scattered deep across the hemisphere, their roots sunk too firmly to ever be severed. In these new lands, human ingenuity flowered with astonishing variety. Along the broad rivers of the Mississippi, communities raised earthworks that scraped the sky. At Cahokia, a city of mounds and plazas stretched wider than medieval London, its rulers gazing from wooden palisades upon fields that fed tens of thousands. The air rang with traders' voices, shells from the Gulf mingling with copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian blades carried from the far reaches of the West. Here was no wilderness, but a metropolis of ceremony, commerce, and power. Far to the southwest, among cliffs painted red by the desert sun, another people built homes that clung to stone like swallow nests. The ancestral Puebloans cut chambers into canyon walls, their kivas sunk deep into earth for rites whose meanings whispered only to the initiated. Corn, beans, and squash thrived in terraced fields coaxed from unforgiving soil, while pottery bore designs as intricate as woven song. At Chaco Canyon, great houses rose in ordered alignment with the stars, proof that human hands could shape not only stone, but the heavens themselves into architecture. On the Atlantic seaboard, the Iroquois Confederacy bound together nations in a pact of law and kinship. Under the Great Tree of Peace, chiefs raised their voices in councils where war could be ended by words rather than spears. Wampum belts carried messages as enduring as parchment, their patterns encoding promises and treaties that outlasted generations. In a world where many still lived by the cycle of raid and reprisal, the Haudenosaunee forged unity through deliberation and balance, creating a league strong enough to resist storms both within and beyond their forests. The open grasslands of the central continent belonged to the horse long before the animal arrived. Here, herds of bison thundered across the plains, black waves upon a green sea. Hunters tracked them on foot with bows of sinew and arrows tipped with flint, each kill demanding reverence and ritual. When horses, descended from creatures native to these same lands, yet reintroduced by Europeans, eventually galloped across the plains, they became not an intrusion, but a revelation, transforming ancient traditions into something new. Yet even before that day, the peoples of the plains lived in harmony, with herds whose survival mirrored their own. Trade bound these worlds together, like sinew lashing spear to shaft. Obsidian from Yellowstone traveled eastward into valleys where its volcanic sparkle was prized. Feathers from macaws in Central America found their way northward into the hands of priests who had never seen the tropics. Ideas traveled with equal ease. Farming practices, sacred stories, medicines crafted from plants whose powers were known to shamans as well as healers. No border divided these exchanges. Rivers and paths carried them as naturally as blood courses through veins. Across every region, spirit breathed through the land. Mountains spoke with the voices of ancestors. Rivers bore the memory of journeys. Animals carried wisdom that instructed human lives. There was no sharp division between natural and sacred, no line that separated daily labor from reverence. Planting corn meant honoring the Earth Mother. Setting a snare meant speaking to the spirit of the hare. Death itself was but a passage, a turning of the circle where the departed rejoined the world in forms both seen and unseen. Communities adapted with ingenuity to every environment. In the Arctic, where winters swallowed the sun, Inuit hunters carved shelters from snow and rode upon seas of ice in boats of sealskin. In California's valleys, acorns fell in such profusion that they became bred, ground, and leached until bitterness was gone. On the northwest coast, cedar yielded canoes large enough to master turbulent seas, and totem poles rose like frozen songs, each carving a genealogy that stretched from myth into memory. Each adaptation declared the same truth. This hemisphere was not empty, but full, and every corner echoed with human life. By the time European sails cut across the horizon, the population of the Americas numbered in the tens of millions. Vast networks of paths stretched across forests and plains, so worn that Spanish explorers mistook them for Roman roads. Agriculture had reshaped landscapes. Irrigation ditches glimmered in desert sunlight, while forest gardens mingled cultivation with wild growth in patterns so subtle, Europeans failed to see their human design. To the newcomers, this seemed a wilderness waiting for civilization. To those who lived there, it was already a tapestry, woven by centuries of hands. Yet even among flourishing nations, omens stirred. Droughts tested the resilience of Chaco's great houses, driving migrations that scattered clans across the Southwest. Warfare grew among the Mississippians as rival chiefs contested for dominance, their palisades bristling with defenders. In the Northeast, shifting alliances kept the balance of peace fragile, a league of nations always at risk of fracture. These strains revealed that no civilization is unchanging, and that the forces of time erode every stone, no matter how high it is raised. Still, nothing in these cycles prepared the continent for the arrival of ships carrying strangers across the sea. Those sails, white against the horizon, carried more than explorers. They bore a collision of worlds. With them came iron and gunpowder, horses and cattle, crosses and crowns. More terrible still, they carried invisible armies of disease, sweeping ahead of settlers like wildfire before the wind. Yet that meeting still lay in the future. In the centuries before Columbus, the peoples of the Americas thrived according to rhythms older than memory, masters of environments they had shaped and been shaped by. Imagine standing on the banks of the Mississippi in the year 1000 as the sun sets behind Cahokia's central mound. Smoke rises from countless hearths. Traders call out their wares. Children chase each other through packed streets. The air carries the scent of maize, the murmur of prayers, the beat of drums echoing against the evening sky. This is no wilderness. It is civilization, alive with its own wisdoms, its own struggles, its own triumphs. And it is here, long before foreign sails break the horizon, that the story of America truly begins. Storms rolled across the Atlantic as fragile ships pressed forward, their sails taut with ambition and desperation. To those aboard, the ocean seemed endless, a wilderness of water where days stretched without landfall, and nights filled with stars that looked down with ancient indifference. Yet beyond the horizon lay rumors of treasure and lands beyond imagining. When Christopher Columbus anchored his small fleet in Caribbean waters in 1492, he believed he had reached Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon a world that would change his own more profoundly than he could ever know. For the Spanish crown, the discovery was less accident than opportunity. Ferdinand and Isabella, triumphant from the Reconquista's victory over Granada, saw in these islands the beginning of a new campaign, one not against Moorish fortresses, but against distance itself. Within a generation, Spain planted footholds from Hispaniola to Cuba, their settlements springing up like outposts of another continent. From there, expeditions struck the mainland. Florida's coasts were claimed, its swamps swallowing more soldiers than battles, while further south, conquistadors carved empires from the ruins of the Aztec and Inca. To the north, however, Spanish dreams often outpaced their grasp. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, endured as the first lasting European town in what would one day be the United States. But its survival came more from sheer resilience than abundant prosperity. France entered the contest not with armies, but with riverboats and alliances. Explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain steered inland along the St. Lawrence and down the Mississippi, weaving a network of settlements and trade that bound their fortunes to native nations. Furs became their currency, pelts from beaver and otter flowing into European markets where hats marked wealth and fashion. Unlike Spain's grand cities of stone and iron, the French presence spread like veins through waterways and forests, subtle but persistent, their survival tied to diplomacy as much as muskets. Along these rivers, Frenchmen married into local tribes, forging bonds of kinship that proved as enduring as their trading posts. Meanwhile, Dutch ambitions flashed briefly across the map. In 1624, they planted New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, a settlement born more of commerce than conquest. Dutch traders cared little for missionary work or imperial visions. What mattered was profit. Their merchants sailed between Africa, the Caribbean, and the New World's northern harbors, filling warehouses with sugar, tobacco, and furs. Though Dutch rule would last only a generation before English warships arrived, their legacy lingered in place names, tolerance of diverse peoples, and the bustling spirit of trade that would remain New York's heartbeat. Still, it was England's colonies that would grow from fragile beginnings into a force destined to break free and reshape the world. In 1607, Jamestown rose from the swamps of Virginia, its wooden palisades more fragile than the dreams of its investors. Hunger gnawed at the settlers, disease withered their numbers, and only the intervention of Powhatan's people spared the colony from collapse. Even then, survival often balanced on uneasy truces. The encounter between John Smith and Pocahontas, later softened into romantic legend, in truth revealed a collision of two worlds negotiating survival. Her eventual marriage to John Rolfe, who introduced tobacco cultivation, symbolized both fragile reconciliation and the deep entanglement that would follow. Tobacco soon became Virginia's lifeblood, its smoke drifting not only from pipes, but across oceans, as barrels filled London's docks with wealth drawn from exhausted soil and enslaved labour. Northward, another vision took root. In 1620, the Mayflower carried a different company, men and women who sought not gold, but freedom of conscience. Landing at Plymouth, they endured a winter so cruel that half perished. The survivors, aided by Wampanoag allies, established a community whose endurance carried significance far beyond its numbers. They spoke of covenants and divine purpose, binding themselves by agreements that echoed through future generations. Their example, however romanticized, became a symbol of perseverance and the pursuit of liberty. Conflict with indigenous nations was never far behind. As settlements spread, farmland encroached upon hunting grounds, treaties frayed, and violence erupted. The Powhatan Wars scarred Virginia. In New England, the Pequot War of the 1630s ended with villages burned and survivors sold into slavery. Even more devastating came later. King Philip's War of the 1670s, when Wampanoag leader Metacom rallied tribes in a desperate stand. Flames consumed towns. Thousands died on both sides, and the war left New England shattered. For native peoples, it marked catastrophe. For the colonists, it hardened the conviction that survival required dominance. While blood was shed on the frontiers, another force shaped destiny in the fields: slavery. From the earliest decades, enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic in chains, their lives bought and sold to fuel the plantation economies. Sugar in the Caribbean, rice in the Carolinas, tobacco in Virginia, all demanded labor measured in human suffering. By the mid-17th century, slavery had begun to root itself not as a temporary expedient, but as a permanent institution, its shadow stretching forward into centuries of conflict and pain. Even among the colonists themselves, discontent simmered. In 1676, Virginia erupted in Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, a planter frustrated with Governor Berkeley's policies, led armed settlers against both native peoples and colonial authority. Plantations burned, Jamestown itself went up in flames, and though the rebellion collapsed, its echoes carried far. It revealed the fragility of colonial order and the volatility of a society split between elites and the struggling poor. In its aftermath, leaders tightened racial hierarchies, binding the system of slavery even more firmly as a tool to divide and control. By the close of the 17th century, the Atlantic had become less a barrier than a bridge. Ships crisscrossed between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, carrying not only goods, but people, cultures, and diseases. In coastal towns, docks rang with the sound of many tongues: English and Dutch, French and Spanish, the cries of Africans torn from homelands, and the voices of native peoples negotiating survival. The age of encounter had become an age of entanglement, each group reshaping and being reshaped by the others. To walk through Boston's streets by 1700 was to hear church bells and merchants haggling over barrels of fish bound for Caribbean plantations. To stand in a Virginia field was to watch enslaved labor bend under the sun, while overseers calculated profits in London currency. To linger in New France was to see a priest raising a cross beside a river, where Algonquin traders met voyagers bearing muskets and goods. Each scene testified that a new world was no longer a dream. It was reality, complex, violent, and irreversible. The Atlantic storms still raged, but the people who crossed them no longer saw themselves as visitors. They built homes, carved farms from forests, laid out streets, and raised children who had never seen the lands their parents had left behind. The seeds of future nations were already in the soil. Yet with them grew tensions between colonists and native peoples, between free and enslaved, between distant crowns and subjects who began to imagine their own destinies. The collision of cultures had birthed something new, fragile as a sapling, yet destined to spread until its roots reached deep into every shore of the continent. Drums echoed through the forests of the Ohio Valley, their beat mingling with the clash of muskets and the shouts of men stumbling through tangled undergrowth. Smoke curled above crude stockades where colonists and British regulars held out against French forces and their native allies. It was 1754, and war had reached the frontier. Here, George Washington, still a young officer, learned the cruel lessons of command, retreat through mud, negotiation under duress, and the cost of ambition in a land claimed by empires that could not agree where their boundaries lay. The French and Indian War had begun, and with it the unraveling of the bond between colonies and crown. The conflict swept across the continent. Red-coated regiments advanced into wilderness that swallowed them whole, while Mohawk and Shawnee warriors guided, ambushed, and determined outcomes more than generals in London could ever imagine. Forts fell in fire, villages emptied into forests. Though Britain emerged victorious in 1763, driving France from Canada and securing new lands to the Mississippi, the triumph was double-edged. The treasury lay drained, and debts demanded revenue. Colonists who had fought shoulder to shoulder with imperial troops soon discovered that their sacrifices brought not freedom to expand westward, but new restrictions. That same year, resistance flared in the heart of the interior. Pontiac, the Ottawa leader, gathered tribes to resist British encroachment. Fort after fort fell to sudden assault. Settlers fled eastward, and panic spread. Though eventually checked, the uprising convinced London to halt expansion beyond the Appalachians. A royal proclamation declared the frontier closed, but men who had buried kin on contested soil seethed at the decree. The very land they had fought to secure was denied them, and resentment smoldered like embers waiting for dry tinder. Meanwhile, the colonies themselves had matured into a patchwork of distinct yet interconnected societies. In New England, Puritan strictness softened into bustling towns where shipyards clanged and fishmongers shouted by the wharves. In the middle colonies, wheat fields spread wide across valleys, feeding not only neighbors but markets across the Atlantic. Quakers in Pennsylvania preached peace, even as Scots-Irish settlers pressed into contested hills. In the south, plantation houses stood like miniature courts, their wealth built on enslaved African labor that harvested tobacco, indigo, and rice under the sun. From Maine's rocky coast to Georgia's marshes, the settlements had become something more than fragile outposts. They were provinces with economies, cultures, and ambitions of their own. Even so, they were far from united. Religious quarrels divided communities, and dissenters often carved new towns to escape the authority of their neighbors. Still, bonds began to form in unexpected ways. The Great Awakening thundered through towns and hamlets alike in the 1730s and 1740s. Itinerant preachers drew thousands into fields, their voices shaking crowds with visions of damnation and salvation. George Whitefield's booming sermons echoed from seaports to villages, his words reaching rich and poor, enslaved and free. These gatherings did more than stir souls. They reminded listeners across distant colonies that they shared a common experience, a spiritual awakening that ignored borders. At the same time, ideas whispered across the Atlantic in the pages of books and pamphlets. Locke's arguments about natural rights, Montesquieu's calls for balanced government, Voltaire's sharp satire, all found eager readers. Benjamin Franklin, once a runaway apprentice, rose to prominence by publishing essays, inventing contraptions and experimenting with lightning. His success embodied possibility, that in these provinces talent could lift a man higher than pedigree. To many, Franklin symbolized both the promise of colonial life and the growing realization that they were not mere extensions of Europe, but societies capable of standing on their own intellectual and political feet. Prosperity and ideas met the hard edge of imperial control in 1765 with the Stamp Act. Suddenly, every printed sheet, newspapers, contracts, even playing cards, carried a tax stamped in the king's name. Outrage erupted. Merchants closed shops in protest. Lawyers thundered in assemblies, and mobs filled streets with cries of liberty. Effigies of royal officials hung from trees. Stamped papers were consigned to flames. Across the seaboard, colonists began to realize that opposition was not isolated but widespread, and resistance carried power when shared. British troops soon became a familiar sight in port cities, their red coats glaring reminders of authority. Far from calming unrest, their presence provoked confrontation. In March 1770, tension boiled over in Boston when snowballs and taunts gave way to musket fire. 5 men fell to the cobblestones, their blood staining the street as townspeople shouted of massacre. Pamphlets carried the news far beyond Massachusetts, transforming a local tragedy into a symbol of oppression. Resentment did not abate. In 1773, when Parliament insisted on taxing imported tea, colonists staged defiance by night. Disguised as Mohawk warriors, they boarded ships in Boston Harbor and hurled chests into the water. Salt spray mingled with the scent of steeping leaves as the cargo floated, then sank. What might have been dismissed as vandalism carried instead the weight of rebellion. London's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known to the colonists as intolerable, closed ports and curtailed assemblies, convincing many that their liberties hung by a thread. As crisis deepened, voices rose in unity. In 1774, delegates from across the provinces gathered in Philadelphia. Farmers, merchants, and lawyers sat side by side, their accents betraying origins from New England, the Chesapeake, and the backcountry, yet their purpose was shared. They drafted petitions, debated rights, and resolved to resist encroachments on their freedoms. Though loyalty to the king remained, the gathering marked a step no one could ignore. The colonies had spoken together as one body for the first time. Beyond the halls of Congress, ordinary lives carried on. Fields planted, ships unloaded, sermons preached. But an undercurrent of change coursed through every community. Taverns buzzed with talk of boycotts and liberties. Newspapers carried cartoons mocking ministers in London. Militia mustered more frequently on village greens. The sense grew that these people were no longer simply colonists, but something new, something forming in the crucible of shared struggle. By the close of 1774, storm clouds gathered over the Atlantic seaboard. Muskets gleamed in hidden armories. Words sharpened in pamphlets, and tempers flared between governors and assemblies. The empire still stood, but its pillars trembled. In 13 provinces that had begun as scattered ventures of faith, fortune, and survival, the seeds of rebellion had taken root. The soil was ready, and the coming season would bring fire. Dawn broke over Lexington Green on April 19th, 1775, carrying with it a silence so taut it seemed the world itself held its breath. Farmers stood clutching muskets, their faces lined with fear and resolve. Across the field marched the king's soldiers, boots striking in unison, bayonets gleaming in morning light. No one intended the first shot, yet when it cracked across the still air, the sound rippled through history. Muskets fired, smoke rolled, and men fell. What had been protest now became war. The skirmish at Lexington and the running battle at Concord sent shockwaves across the colonies. Militias rallied, bells rang from church towers, and countryside roads filled with men streaming toward Boston. Farmers left plows in their furrows, shopkeepers bolted doors, and apprentices seized muskets. In the span of a day, a world ruled by petitions and debates had tipped into bloodshed. The shot heard round the world announced that the struggle was no longer a quarrel over taxes, but a fight for existence. Within weeks, an improvised army gathered outside Boston. Farmers in homespun stood beside frontiersmen hardened by wilderness, while ministers preached beneath elm trees before battles. George Washington, tall and commanding in his bearing, took command at Cambridge in 1775. He found not a disciplined force, but a collection of militias, brave yet unruly, willing to fight yet reluctant to endure order. His task was Herculean: forge these men into an army that could stand against the greatest military machine of the age. In Philadelphia, delegates assembled once more, now faced with a choice that grew sharper by the month. Were they subjects seeking reconciliation, or a people preparing for separation? Pamphlets pushed them toward the latter. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776, exploded like a cannon blast in public discourse. "'Tis time to part," he declared, urging ordinary people to see monarchy as tyranny and independence as common destiny. His words sold by the tens of thousands, crossing tavern tables and church pews alike, convincing farmers as much as scholars that the moment demanded nothing less than freedom. That summer, quills scratched across parchment in Independence Hall. Jefferson's draft declared truths self-evident, words that would outlive musket fire and cannon shot. On July 4th, 1776, delegates approved the Declaration of Independence. Bells rang, crowds cheered, yet the jubilation masked a grim reality. Britain had never looked more formidable, and the colonies had never stood more vulnerable. They had declared themselves a nation without the guarantee they could defend it. War swept swiftly across the land. New York became the crucible where Washington's fledgling army faced humiliation. Redcoats poured onto Long Island in overwhelming numbers, and the Continental forces suffered defeat after defeat. Yet Washington refused despair. Under cover of night and fog, he ferried his troops across the East River, saving the army from annihilation. His genius lay not in winning every battle, but in preserving the cause itself, refusing to let the rebellion be crushed in a single stroke. Winter brought him to the banks of the Delaware, where frost-bitten men left bloody footprints in the snow. Supplies dwindled, enlistments expired, morale withered. In these desperate days, Washington chose audacity. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his men across the icy river, surprising Hessian troops at Trenton. Muskets roared, drums beat, and stunned mercenaries surrendered by dawn. The victory, modest in scale, resounded in spirit, reviving hope when the cause seemed doomed. Princeton followed weeks later, and the legend of Washington's resolve began to take shape. The struggle unfolded not only in pitched battles, but in homes and hearts. Wives managed farms, spun cloth, and carried water to soldiers. Enslaved men weighed the promises of liberty offered by both sides, freedom for service in British ranks, or the faint hope of emancipation if the new nation embraced its ideals. Native nations faced choices no less agonizing: ally with the crown to halt colonial expansion, or risk everything by siding with neighbors who hungered for land. Revolution touched every household. whether with sacrifice, opportunity, or loss. By 1777, fortune shifted at Saratoga. In New York's forests, American forces surrounded and compelled General Burgoyne's surrender, capturing thousands of troops. The victory resounded far beyond the colonies. In Paris, diplomats seized their chance. Franklin, with his wit and charm, convinced the French court that the rebellion was no lost cause. In 1778, France entered the war, bringing fleets, money, and soldiers. The conflict had transformed from a colonial uprising into a global struggle, stretching from the Caribbean to India, where Britain now faced rivals on every sea. Even so, triumph abroad did not end hardship at home. At Valley Forge, in the bitter winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's camp endured suffering that tested the very meaning of endurance. Men wrapped rags around bare feet, ate meager rations, and buried comrades in frozen earth. Despair threatened to hollow the army. But through the snow came discipline. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a keen eye and blunt tongue, drilled ragged companies until they moved like soldiers. Out of hunger and cold emerged a hardened force, ready to stand toe-to-toe with redcoats on open fields. The war dragged into the south, where fighting grew brutal. Guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harried British patrols in Carolina swamps, striking swiftly before vanishing into reeds. Plantations burned, neighbors turned upon neighbors, and the war became as much civil strife as international conflict. Charleston fell, but at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, rebel forces scored victories that swung momentum back toward the cause. Every skirmish, every raid, chipped away at Britain's hold on the provinces. By 1781, the struggle converged upon Virginia. Cornwallis entrenched his army at Yorktown, unaware that a trap closed around him. Washington marched south with French troops, while Admiral de Grasse sealed the bay with his fleet. Cannon thundered for days. Earthworks shattered, and redoubt after redoubt fell under relentless assault. Surrounded and outgunned, Cornwallis surrendered his army. The news raced across the continent, victory at last. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris confirmed what had been won on the battlefield. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, ceding territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The rebellion had become revolution, and revolution had birthed a nation. Yet beneath the celebrations lay unease. The new republic stood fragile, its unity uncertain, its government untested, its ideals lofty but unproven. On the fields where farmers once stood against bayonets, silence returned. The smoke of war lifted, leaving graves, widows, and veterans carrying scars. But from those sacrifices emerged something extraordinary. 13 former colonies, now united as a nation. Their story was unfinished, their survival far from assured. Still, the impossible had been achieved. They had defied the greatest empire of their age and declared themselves authors of their own destiny. The guns fell silent in 1783, but victory left more questions than answers. 13 former colonies stood free, not as a nation united by habit or custom, but as fragile partners bound by necessity. The Articles of Confederation gave them a framework so weak it barely held them together. No power to tax, no ability to enforce laws across state lines, no central authority to bind disputes. Each state guarded its independence like treasure, suspicious of any neighbor who might grow too strong. For all the triumph of Yorktown, peace revealed how uncertain the experiment truly was. In Philadelphia, taverns, merchants grumbled that debts went unpaid because Congress could not raise funds. Farmers in western Massachusetts rose in Shays' Rebellion, their anger fueled by taxes and foreclosures. Courthouses closed under the pressure of armed protesters, and frightened leaders feared the chaos might spiral into anarchy. Watching from Mount Vernon, George Washington wrote with dismay, wondering whether the hard-won liberty was dissolving into disorder before it had taken root. Many who had resisted royal power now realized a different truth. Liberty without stability could destroy itself. By the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to attempt what many thought impossible: replace the Articles with something stronger. Windows were shut tight against the heat, guards kept doors barred, and debates raged in secret. Some feared monarchy would return in disguise. Others dreaded that democracy itself might unravel. James Madison arrived with notebooks and an ambitious plan, arguing for a system that balanced authority with liberty. Alexander Hamilton, brilliant and abrasive, demanded a vigorous central government that could command respect abroad and order at home. Compromise, not ideology, forged the final result: a constitution that divided power among branches, balanced states both large and small, and established a framework flexible enough to endure. Ratification did not come easily. Anti-federalists warned of tyranny in new clothing, demanding guarantees that individual rights would not be swallowed by government power. In newspapers, pseudonymous writers like Publius defended the new system with essays that probed history and philosophy as deftly as they addressed daily concerns. These Federalist papers became both persuasion and prophecy, articulating principles that would echo long beyond their immediate debate. Still, acceptance required a bargain: the promise of amendments that would shield the liberties of citizens. Out of that demand came the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments enshrining freedoms of speech, religion, assembly, and the protection against arbitrary authority. When Washington took the oath as the first president in 1789, he did so with reluctance. Age and weariness weighed on him, but duty outweighed desire. Every gesture set precedent. He refused pomp, preferring dignity without grandeur. He created a cabinet, balanced factions, and guided the young republic with steady caution. When farmers in Pennsylvania rose against a whiskey tax in 1794, Washington mounted his horse and rode at the head of troops to enforce federal authority. Bloodshed was minimal, but the message unmistakable. The new government possessed not only paper laws, but the power to enforce them. Foreign entanglements tested his leadership as fiercely as domestic disputes. The French Revolution erupted across the Atlantic, inspiring some Americans and alarming others. When Britain and France clashed, both sought to drag the fledgling republic into their conflict. Washington stood firm in neutrality, determined that the United States not be crushed in struggles it could not afford. His farewell address, delivered at the close of his second term, warned against partisanship and foreign alliances, a counsel born from experience, though destined to be often ignored. John Adams followed, inheriting a nation still unsteady. Brilliant, stubborn, and often prickly, he confronted challenges that would have undone a lesser man. Relations with France collapsed into a quasi-war at sea, where American ships battled French privateers. At home, fear of subversion led to the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws that stretched federal power and muzzled dissent. Critics cried tyranny, pamphlets denounced the administration, and political divisions deepened. For the first time, partisanship split the Republic into camps. Federalists on one side, Democratic Republicans on the other. The election of 1800 proved as momentous as any battlefield victory. Bitter rivals Adams and Jefferson contested the presidency, their supporters flinging accusations of monarchy and radicalism. The vote ended in deadlock, decided only after tense maneuvering in Congress. Jefferson's eventual triumph marked not merely a transfer of power, but a revelation. Authority could pass peacefully between factions, not through swords, but through ballots. This revolution of 1800 ensured that the Republic would endure not only through war, but through political contest. By the turn of the century, the United States had survived its first great test. From rebellion had come governance. From fragile alliance had come enduring structure. Its constitution was unproven but alive, its leaders imperfect but resolute. Abroad, few believed the experiment would last. At home, even its defenders knew storm still lay ahead. But for the first time, the framework of a nation stood secure, shaped by compromise, hardened by crisis, and poised to grow beyond anything its founders could yet imagine. The election of 1800 ended in silence more profound than cannon fire. No barricades lined the streets, no militias clashed, no palace guards secured the throne. Instead, power passed from one political faction to another through ballots and procedure. Thomas Jefferson, the planter from Virginia who had penned the Declaration, placed his hand on a Bible and swore the oath of office. He called his victory a revolution, not for bloodshed, but for proving that government could change hands without violence. In a world ruled by monarchs, this was as radical as any battle. Jefferson's vision for the Republic was simple yet ambitious. A nation of farmers, independent and virtuous, spreading across abundant land. Fortune favored him when Napoleon, desperate for funds to fuel war in Europe, offered to sell an empire. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the territory of the United States with a stroke of the pen. Critics questioned its legality. Nowhere did the Constitution mention buying vast domains, but Jefferson seized the chance. For $15 million, the young republic acquired a frontier that stretched from the Mississippi to the Rockies, a canvas for generations to come. Exploration followed swiftly. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led an expedition westward, their journals filled with accounts of rivers broad as seas, prairies alive with bison, and peaks that split the sky. They recorded plants unknown to science, mapped courses for future travelers, and built fragile relationships with tribes whose lives the expansion would soon overwhelm. Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman traveling with her infant, guided and translated, ensuring survival where ignorance might have meant death. Their journey captured the imagination of a people convinced that destiny lay not on the coast, but in the vast interior. Not all dreams followed such peaceful routes. In 1804, rivalry between two former comrades turned to fatal encounter. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton met at dawn along the Hudson. Pistols raised, shots fired, and Hamilton, architect of the nation's finances and Washington's trusted aide, fell mortally wounded. The duel shocked the Republic, proof that personal ambition and bitterness could still erupt in violence even among its highest leaders. Burr's political career disintegrated, while Hamilton's death left a void in the Federalist vision of strong central authority. The new century soon tested the nation in war once more. British warships prowled the seas, seizing American sailors, while in the interior, native confederacies resisted encroachment. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, sought to defend national honor. In 1812, Congress declared war on the empire the colonies had once defied. The conflict staggered across frontiers and coastlines. Washington, D.C. itself went up in flames in 1814. as British troops torched the Capitol and White House. Yet at Baltimore, defenders held firm as rockets burst over Fort McHenry, inspiring a lawyer named Francis Scott Key to pen lines that would endure as anthem. In the Western theater, the struggle carried a different face. Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, envisioned a confederacy that might halt the relentless tide of settlement. Charismatic, eloquent, and unyielding, he traveled from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, urging unity among tribes long divided. His brother, the Prophet, preached spiritual renewal alongside political resistance. Their movement challenged not only American expansion, but the fractures within native life itself. At the Battle of the Thames in 1813, Tecumseh fell, and with him, the dream of a lasting confederation faded. The frontier remained open, but the price was measured in lives and lost sovereignty. Though the war ended in stalemate on paper, Americans remembered it differently. News of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans in January 1815, fought after peace had been signed in Europe, spread like wildfire. Frontiersmen armed with rifles, free black volunteers, Choctaw allies, and militia routed seasoned British troops. Jackson emerged a national hero, hailed as proof that the Republic could hold its own against the world's mightiest empire. Amid war and expansion, a different revolution stirred, the Second Great Awakening. Camp meetings drew thousands beneath open skies, where preachers thundered of sin and salvation. Converts fell to their knees, shouted, wept, and rose reborn. The revival cut across lines of class and gender, offering not only spiritual renewal, but moral purpose. Out of its fervor grew reform movements that would define the century. Abolitionists demanding slavery's end, women seeking greater rights, and advocates calling for temperance and education. Faith, once private, became a force shaping the Republic's conscience. As the 1820s unfolded, the United States looked outward as well as inward. In 1823, President James Monroe announced a doctrine that startled the world. The Western Hemisphere was closed to European colonization. Any attempt by old empires to reclaim ground in the Americas would be seen as hostile. Though the young nation lacked the power to enforce such bold words, Britain's navy conveniently ensured the line was respected. The proclamation marked a shift. The Republic now cast itself as guardian of an entire hemisphere, a role it would grow into over time. Jackson himself soon carried the banner of a new era. Elected president in 1828, he embodied frontier democracy, rough, combative, distrustful of elites. Admirers hailed him as the champion of the common man. Critics saw in him a demagogue who trampled norms. His victory revealed the expanding power of ordinary white men in politics, as property restrictions on voting fell and popular participation surged. But Jackson's legacy carried darker shadows. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, clearing the way for settlers by forcing native nations from ancestral homelands. Treaties signed under pressure, a military force drove the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole from the southeast. The Trail of Tears saw thousands march westward under brutal conditions, their lives broken by a policy that valued cotton profits over human survival. Jackson defended removal as progress. History remembered it as dispossession on a massive scale. Beneath these triumphs and tragedies, the Republic's fault lines deepened. As new states entered the Union, fierce debates erupted. Would they embrace slavery or reject it? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance free and slave states, drawing a line across the map that sought to contain the conflict. But the compromise was fragile, a bandage over a wound that widened with every passing decade. When Jackson's presidency ended, The nation stood larger, surer of itself, and clearer in its sense of who it was. It had doubled its land, survived another war against Britain, asserted a voice in global affairs, and expanded political participation among white men. Yet the gains carried costs. Native nations uprooted, enslaved labor entrenched more deeply in the South, sectional rivalries sharpening. The frontier beckoned, promising boundless opportunity, while beneath the promise lay tensions that would one day ignite into fire. The Rio Grande glittered under a punishing sun when American and Mexican troops clashed in 1846. Within months, Congress declared war. Volunteers streamed south, convinced that victory would expand the nation's borders and its destiny. The conflict delivered triumphs: Zachary Taylor at Buena Vista, Winfield Scott's march into Mexico City, and by 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo surrendered half of Mexico's territory. The United States now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The celebration, however, masked a darker reality. Every mile of new land revived the same agonizing question: would slavery spread westward or be confined? The debate consumed Congress. Some demanded slavery's expansion as a matter of property rights. Others argued that free labor must dominate the frontier. The Compromise of 1850 sought to settle the matter. California entered the Union as free, while harsher fugitive slave laws reassured the South. But the solution satisfied neither. The new law forced citizens of northern towns to aid in capturing escapees or face penalties themselves. Families watched as men and women who had lived among them for years were dragged back into bondage. Resistance surged, with abolitionists opening safe houses, funding legal challenges, and defying the law outright. Among them, Harriet Tubman's courage became legendary. Repeatedly, she returned south, guiding fugitives through woods and rivers along a secret network that came to be called the Underground Railroad. The decade that followed turned the frontier into a battlefield. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned previous limits by declaring that settlers themselves would decide slavery's fate. Pro-slavery settlers crossed from Missouri with rifles in hand. Free soilers armed themselves in reply. Elections were corrupted by fraud and intimidation. In towns like Lawrence, presses were destroyed, homes torched, and streets ran with blood. Guerrilla bands clashed across prairies in a cycle of raid and reprisal that earned the territory its grim name, Bleeding Kansas. The soil of the West, meant to promise opportunity, instead became an omen of national fracture. The violence soon reached the halls of government. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner denounced the slave power with blistering words. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and struck Sumner repeatedly with a cane until he collapsed. Blood pooled on the chamber floor as colleagues struggled to stop the attack. Across the nation, newspapers carried the story. In the South, Brooks was hailed as a defender of honor. In the North, Sumner was celebrated as a martyr. Debate had turned to physical assault at the very heart of the Republic. The courts deepened the crisis. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Scott, enslaved yet long resident in free territory, had sued for his freedom. The court declared that no black person, free or enslaved, could claim citizenship, and that Congress lacked power to restrict slavery in the territories. Chief Justice Roger Taney's opinion struck like thunder. Decades of compromises were swept aside. Southern leaders rejoiced in vindication. Northern outrage blazed. For abolitionists, The ruling confirmed their darkest suspicion, that law itself had become servant to slavery. As the nation convulsed, voices rose in defiance. Frederick Douglass, whose own escape from bondage had carried him to freedom, stood before audiences from Massachusetts to Britain and demanded recognition of slavery's brutality. His words carried a power born of lived experience, exposing the hypocrisy of a republic that proclaimed liberty while holding millions in chains. Writers and activists joined him. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin sold in the hundreds of thousands, dramatizing the cruelty of families torn apart, bodies scarred, and spirits crushed. Southerners dismissed it as propaganda, but countless readers felt their conscience stirred. For those unmoved by political arguments, story proved more powerful than law. On the frontier, a man of iron conviction chose violence where others sought persuasion. John Brown, gaunt and intense, believed slavery a sin that could only be cleansed by blood. In Kansas, he and his followers hacked pro-slavery settlers to death in the darkness, convinced they carried divine justice. In 1859, Brown struck at Harper's Ferry, seizing the Federal Armory in a desperate bid to ignite a slave uprising. The plan collapsed. His men were killed or captured, and Brown himself taken prisoner. At his trial, he spoke calmly, insisting that he had sought only to free the oppressed. When he went to the gallows, some saw fanaticism, others saw prophecy. His composure in death electrified the North and terrified the South. Meanwhile, politics fractured. The once dominant Whig Party crumbled, torn apart by irreconcilable stances on slavery. From its ashes rose the Republican Party, pledged to halt slavery's expansion, though not yet to abolish it outright. Its ranks drew farmers, artisans, and reformers who feared that the institution threatened free labor and Republican virtue. The Democratic Party itself split along sectional lines, one wing leaning south, the other straining to hold the Union together. National elections became referendums on slavery's future, each contest inflaming passions further. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 captured the divide with theater as sharp as any musket volley. On Illinois fields and in packed halls, Abraham Lincoln argued that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. Stephen Douglas countered with popular sovereignty, insisting that local choice could diffuse national tension. Crowds gathered by the thousands, cheering and jeering as the two men sparred. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but his eloquence carried his name across the country, preparing the stage for his rise 2 years later. The election of 1860 shattered what unity remained. Lincoln won with a platform opposing slavery's spread, but without carrying a single Southern state. To many in the South, his victory proved the Union no longer offered protection for their way of life. Before the year ended, South Carolina declared secession, soon followed by others. Delegates drafted a new constitution, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and raised banners proclaiming themselves a separate nation. In Washington, leaders scrambled for compromise, but none could bridge the gulf. Northern abolitionists would not sanction the spread of bondage. Southern fire-eaters would not tolerate limitation. Militias drilled, arsenals changed hands. Newspapers printed rhetoric that scorched the page. A republic born of revolution now teetered towards civil war, undone not by foreign invasion, but by the contradiction it had carried since birth. The decades after victory over Mexico had promised glory, new territories, wider horizons, a republic extending from sea to sea. Instead, each expansion tore deeper at the nation's fabric. Every law intended to settle the matter only revealed how unbridgeable the chasm had become. By 1861, storm clouds no longer lingered on the horizon. They gathered overhead, heavy and dark, ready to break. The war that followed would not merely decide boundaries, it would determine the very meaning of the United States. Charleston Harbor thundered with cannon fire on April 12, 1861. Confederate batteries encircled Fort Sumter, unleashing 34 hours of bombardment until Union troops, cut off and outgunned, lowered their flag. No lives were lost in the exchange, but the nation's destiny shifted in that instant. Compromise was over. In towns across the South, volunteers rushed to enlist beneath the new banner of secession. In the North, church bells tolled, speeches rang out, and thousands took up arms to defend the Union. A quarrel of words had become a war of survival. At first, both sides imagined a short contest. That illusion dissolved at Bull Run in July 1861. Families rode from Washington with picnic baskets to watch the spectacle, certain the rebellion would collapse after one decisive clash. Instead, panic swept the Union lines when Confederate troops counterattacked, and soldiers fled in chaos alongside terrified spectators. Bull Run revealed the scale of the struggle. It would not be quick, and it would not be bloodless. Armies swelled as months passed. Young men in blue and grey drilled in camps that stretched for miles, while blacksmiths hammered iron into cannon and factories turned out rifles by the thousands. Lincoln, learning the burden of command, sought generals equal to the task. He cycled through cautious leaders until Ulysses S. Grant emerged in the West, relentless in pursuit of victory. Across the South, Robert E. Lee took command of Confederate forces, his daring maneuvers earning devotion from soldiers who endured hunger and hardship. Battles scarred the landscape. At Shiloh in Tennessee, musket volleys echoed through woods and ravines, leaving more than 20,000 dead or wounded in 2 days. The shock rippled through the nation. Many realized for the first time that war meant slaughter on a scale unseen before. At Antietam in September 1862, the fighting raged from dawn until dusk in cornfields and along a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane. By nightfall, over 20,000 lay killed or wounded, making it the bloodiest single day in American history. Lee's advance into the North was halted, but the cost defied comprehension. Antietam gave Lincoln the moment he had awaited. Days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, it took effect, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory free. The document did not end slavery everywhere. Border states loyal to the Union remained untouched, but it transformed the war. The Union now fought not only to preserve itself, but to destroy bondage. For enslaved communities, the news spread like wildfire. Men and women fled plantations to Union lines, swelling the ranks of the army. By war's end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the cause of freedom, their courage reshaping the meaning of the conflict. Abroad, the proclamation shifted diplomacy. Britain and France, once tempted to recognize the Confederacy, recoiled from backing a government now openly fighting to preserve slavery. The South lost hope of foreign intervention, while the Union gained moral ground. In July 1863, destiny collided at Gettysburg. For 3 days, thunder rolled across Pennsylvania fields. On the third day, General George Pickett led thousands in a desperate charge against Union lines. Cannon and rifles tore gaps through gray ranks until the assault crumbled in ruin. Lee's army retreated south, never again able to mount such an invasion. Coupled with Grant's capture of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, the twin victories marked a turning point. The Union had seized momentum. The war, however, ground on. Grant pressed relentlessly in Virginia, hammering Lee's army in a brutal campaign of attrition. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman carved his way through Georgia in 1864, tearing up railroads, burning crops, and leaving cities in flames. His march to the sea brought destruction intended to break Southern will. Civilians felt the war in every ruined barn and empty smokehouse. The conflict had become total, aimed not only at armies, but at the foundations of Southern society. At home, strains mounted. Northern cities erupted in draft riots, most violently in New York in 1863, where mobs lynched black residents and clashed with troops. In the South, shortages grew desperate. Women rioted in Richmond for bread, and Confederate soldiers deserted to feed families left starving. War touched every hearth, not just the battlefield. Through it all, Lincoln carried the burden of leadership with weary resolve. He read letters from grieving mothers, visited hospitals where wounded soldiers lay in agony, and walked the White House halls by lamplight, worn by sorrow. In November 1863, at Gettysburg's dedication, he spoke only 2 minutes, yet his words redefined the struggle. A nation conceived in liberty must prove that democracy itself could endure. His address, modest in length, carried a weight that outlasted every cannon blast. In 1864, Lincoln faced re-election. War weariness was deep. Critics urged negotiation. His opponent, George McClellan, promised compromise. But battlefield successes, Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah, rekindled Northern confidence. Lincoln won decisively, his second inaugural address offering humility rather than triumph. He spoke of shared guilt, of divine judgment, and of the hope that the nation might heal with malice toward none, with charity for all. By spring 1865, the Confederacy was spent. Richmond fell in flames, and Lee, his army starving, surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Grant's terms were generous. Arms surrendered, but soldiers allowed to return home with their horses. The war ended not in vengeance, but in exhaustion and dignity. Soldiers embraced former foes, knowing the carnage had gone far enough. 5 days later, tragedy struck. At Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and fired a pistol shot that ended Lincoln's life. The nation plunged from jubilation into mourning. Crowds lined railway tracks as his funeral train wound through cities draped in black. A people who had doubted his every step now wept for the leader who had carried them through trial to triumph. The Civil War claimed over 600,000 lives, a toll that dwarfed all previous conflicts combined. Fields once fertile were scarred with graves. Towns once bustling lay in ruins. But from that devastation emerged a union preserved and slavery destroyed. The nation that staggered out of the war was transformed. Its future remained uncertain. Reconstruction, reconciliation, and racial justice all lay ahead. But one truth stood clear. The Republic had endured its greatest test, and in surviving, it had been reborn. Sunlight poured across courthouse steps in the Deep South, as lines of black men, some still wearing the scars of chains, waited to cast their first ballots. Federal soldiers stood watch as they dropped slips of paper into boxes once reserved for planters alone. The moment carried triumph, but also peril. Every vote defied centuries of bondage, and every ballot was a challenge to those determined to restore white supremacy. The Union victory had ended slavery, but freedom alone left millions vulnerable. Families newly emancipated sought to reunite with children sold away, wives torn from husbands. Some walked for days along dusty roads, following rumors of kin. Others built schools in church basements, convinced that letters on a page could anchor their liberty more firmly than chains ever had. Friedman's bureau agents tried to guide the transition, drawing contracts, distributing rations, establishing classrooms, but they faced hostility at every turn. For many white Southerners, defeat had ended the war, but not their conviction that black men and women must remain subordinate. In Washington, the question of rebuilding became a battle between visions. President Andrew Johnson urged leniency, eager to restore states quickly, with little change beyond formal abolition. Radical Republicans in Congress demanded more: protection for freed people, punishment for former Confederates, and a reconstructed South founded on equality. Their clash reshaped government itself. Congress overrode presidential vetoes, asserting that the nation must be remade, not merely patched together. Reconstruction governments took shape under military protection. Conventions drafted new constitutions, expanding rights and building systems of public education for the first time. Black legislators entered state houses, and in 1870, Hiram Revels of Mississippi took a Senate seat once held by Jefferson Davis, symbolizing how radically the world had turned. Town meetings saw freedmen debate taxes and roads alongside white neighbors, often for the first time in recorded history. But the backlash came swift and brutal. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan rode by night, their hoods concealing faces, their torches lighting terror. Teachers were whipped, churches burned, voters threatened. Violence became the language of resistance, designed to undo what ballots had achieved. Northern resolve faltered. As years passed, enthusiasm waned, scandals distracted attention, and fatigue dimmed the will to enforce rights by bayonet. By 1877, a contested presidential election pushed the matter to breaking point. Rutherford B. Hayes secured the White House in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. With bayonets gone, Reconstruction collapsed. State legislatures, once integrated, fell back into white control. Jim Crow laws soon segregated public life, while poll taxes and literacy tests stripped away the vote once promised by the 15th Amendment. Hope had not vanished, but it had been forced underground, surviving in churches, communities, and families that clung to the memory of possibility. While politics stumbled, the economy surged. Railroads spread like arteries across the land, binding regions into a single market. Tracks reached the Pacific, carrying settlers westward and grain eastward, forging an economic unity the war had nearly destroyed. Telegraph wires clicked messages from New York to San Francisco in minutes. Commerce no longer belonged to localities. It spanned a continent. Industrial giants rose with the steel skeletons of their factories. Andrew Carnegie, once a poor Scottish immigrant, built vast steelworks that churned out rails and girders. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil refined kerosene that lit homes across the world. Wealth accumulated on a scale unimaginable a generation earlier, and the skyline of cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago filled with smoke from their furnaces. Even so, prosperity rested on the labor of millions who rarely shared its rewards. Workers endured 12-hour shifts for meager pay. Children hauled coal from dark shafts, and women stitched in sweatshops where fire hazards loomed. Labor movements grew, demanding shorter hours and safer conditions. Strikes erupted in the rail yards, in the steel mills, on city streets, sometimes ending in gunfire as troops restored order. The gilding of the age was thin. Beneath its gold shimmer lay iron discipline and human suffering. Immigrants poured into ports by the hundreds of thousands. Italians crowded tenements in New York. Germans built farms in the Midwest. Chinese workers laid tracks across the Sierra Nevada. Each group brought languages, foods, and traditions, reshaping America's cultural fabric. But they met prejudice as often as opportunity. Anti-immigrant riots scarred cities, and in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first federal law to bar a people from entry on the basis of race. A nation proud of liberty closed its gates even as it depended on immigrant labor to stoke its factories and build its railroads. On the western frontier, native nations confronted a tide that would not stop. Treaties signed in Washington were broken on the ground as settlers poured into lands once promised to tribes. Resistance rose, none more dramatically than at Little Bighorn in 1876, when Lakota and Cheyenne warriors under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse annihilated George Armstrong Custer's cavalry. For a moment, the victory stunned the nation. But the reprisal was swift and overwhelming. Armies swept across the plains, buffalo herds were slaughtered to starvation, and native communities forced onto reservations. In 1890, at Wounded Knee, soldiers opened fire on Lakota men, women, and children, killing hundreds in a massacre that marked the final collapse of armed resistance. The frontier, long mythologized as limitless, was declared closed. Amid these upheavals, cities soared. Chicago rebuilt after its Great Fire, with skyscrapers of steel and glass. Electric lights illuminated exhibitions that promised a dazzling future. Telephones carried voices across neighborhoods. Department stores displayed goods from every continent. To boosters, this was progress without limit, proof that the nation had entered modernity. To critics like Mark Twain, it was the Gilded Age, brilliant on the surface, corrupt and unequal beneath. Senators bowed to railroad barons. Political machines traded favors for votes, and wealth concentrated in the hands of a few while millions struggled in poverty. By the century's close, the United States was unrecognizable compared to the fractured Republic of 1865. Slavery was gone, though its legacy lingered in oppression and segregation. Reconstruction's promise had flickered, then dimmed, but its amendments remained, waiting for future generations to reclaim. Industry had vaulted the nation into global prominence. Cities had absorbed the world's migrants, and the frontier had vanished in blood. The Republic strode into the 20th century with power undeniable and contradictions unresolved. A nation gilded, restless, and unfinished. Smoke rose above Havana's harbor on February 15th, 1898, when the battleship Maine exploded with a roar that echoed across the Atlantic. Whether accident or sabotage, newspapers screamed for vengeance. "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" cried headlines, and within weeks, the United States declared war. Volunteers filled trains heading south, convinced they would liberate Cuba from colonial rule. Few realized they were also ushering in a new chapter, the United States stepping onto the world stage as an empire. The Spanish-American War was brief but decisive. In the Caribbean, American ships shattered Spain's fleet, and troops stormed hills outside Santiago. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey sailed into Manila Bay and destroyed the enemy squadron by dawn. Suddenly, the United States possessed more than victory. It held new territories. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines came under American control, while Cuba, though nominally independent, remained tethered by treaties that ensured Washington's influence. A republic born of anti-colonial rebellion now found itself master of colonies. Debate raged. Was this expansion destiny fulfilled, or betrayal of founding ideals? Imperial burdens proved heavy. In the Philippines, insurgents led by Emilio Aguinaldo resisted American rule with guerrilla tactics. Villages burned, soldiers died in ambushes, and the splendid little war stretched into years of bitter conflict. At home, anti-imperialists protested, arguing that ruling subject peoples contradicted democracy's creed. Yet supporters claimed the nation had a duty to civilize and uplift, echoing rhetoric heard across European empires. The contradiction was plain: liberty at home, empire abroad. At the dawn of a new century, tragedy reshaped leadership. In 1901, President William McKinley fell to an assassin's bullet, and the Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt, strode into office with energy that startled the establishment. Barely in his 40s, Roosevelt embodied vigor. He expanded presidential power, challenged monopolies with antitrust suits, and pushed for reforms to curb the excesses of unchecked industry. To him, government must act as a steward for the public good. Abroad, he pursued what he called the strenuous life. He sent the Great White Fleet around the world to display American might, mediated peace between Russia and Japan, and secured rights to build the Panama Canal. When Colombian authorities balked, Roosevelt encouraged Panama's independence, then seized the chance to carve a waterway linking oceans. By 1914, ships steamed through locks and lakes where once only jungle lay, a monument to engineering and ambition that symbolized America's new reach. Domestically, reforms swept through cities and states. The progressive era demanded clean government, safer workplaces, and limits on corporate power. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed corruption and misery. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle described filth in meatpacking plants, shocking readers into demanding regulation. New laws inspected food and drugs, while factory reforms sought to protect laborers. Women campaigned not only for temperance, but for the vote, organizing marches and parades that rattled politicians. The suffrage movement gathered momentum, though victory remained just out of reach. Not all reform came through law. Charities, settlement houses, and unions grew, offering support to immigrants and workers in cities bursting at the seams. New York's Lower East Side swelled with Jewish and Italian families. Chicago's neighborhoods hummed with Polish, German, and Irish voices. Tenements stacked humanity in narrow rooms, yet from them emerged musicians, writers, and entrepreneurs who added their voices to the nation's chorus. The United States was no longer only Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. It was becoming polyglot, diverse, restless. Nature itself tested resilience. In April 1906, San Francisco shuddered beneath a massive earthquake. Buildings crumbled, fires consumed block after block, and survivors camped in parks among ruins. The disaster revealed both vulnerability and determination. Within years, the city rose again, a testament to the energy of a people convinced that no setback, natural or man-made, could halt their advance. The early 20th century also saw the labor struggle intensify. Miners struck in Colorado. Garment workers in New York marched for shorter hours and better pay. Tragedy struck in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, when flames trapped young women behind locked doors. 146 perished, their deaths forcing new safety standards. Reformers argued that industrial progress could not come at the cost of human lives, and their demands reshaped law as well as conscience. Meanwhile, farmers and small-town citizens confronted changes that left them uneasy. The populist movement had already risen in the 1890s, railing against railroads, banks, and elites. Though the Populist Party faded, its concerns bled into progressive reforms, calls for fair taxation, direct election of senators, and greater accountability. Democracy itself stretched to accommodate the cries of those who felt excluded from the new industrial order. In culture, confidence flourished. Skyscrapers climbed into the sky. Henry Ford's assembly lines produced automobiles by the thousands. And the Wright brothers lifted off at Kitty Hawk in 1903, proving human flight possible. In sports, baseball became the national pastime, while boxing champions drew crowds as large as any political rally. America was not only producing goods, it was exporting culture. By the second decade of the century, attention shifted abroad once more. In 1914, Europe plunged into war, its empires colliding in slaughter on the fields of France. At first, the United States stood apart, President Woodrow Wilson urging neutrality. But German submarines prowled the seas, sinking ships and killing American passengers. Telegrams revealed plots with Mexico, and by 1917, neutrality could no longer be sustained. Congress declared war, and American troops boarded ships for Europe. In France, doughboys marched through mud, their rifles caked and uniforms sodden. They fought in trenches where rats scurried and shells thundered without pause. At Belleau Wood, Marines earned a fierce reputation, driving back seasoned German troops at staggering cost. The arrival of fresh American forces tipped the balance for exhausted allies. In November 1918, the guns fell silent. The United States had not only joined a war, it had helped decide its outcome. At Versailles, Wilson pressed for a League of Nations to preserve peace, though the Senate at home rejected the commitment. Still, the war marked a turning point. No longer a distant republic, America had become a central player in global affairs. From 1898 to 1918, the nation transformed. It defeated Spain, seized overseas territories, built a canal across continents, endured earthquakes and strikes, and sent armies to Europe. Immigrants reshaped its cities, reformers reshaped its laws, and innovators reshaped its future. The Republic entered the 20th century with confidence and contradictions intact, rising as an emerging power, yet still searching for how to wield that power justly. The war had ended, but its echo lingered in factories, cities, and farms. Production lines that had once turned out rifles now produced radios and automobiles. Soldiers came home to a country brimming with confidence, and for a moment it seemed that nothing could slow America's momentum. Streets glowed with electric lights, music pulsed from gramophones, and skyscrapers climbed ever higher above bustling avenues. The United States, flush with victory, believed it had entered an age without limits. Everywhere, the signs of change were visible. The Ford assembly line churned out Model Ts in such numbers that even families of modest means could dream of owning one. Highways spread outward from cities, and gas stations became as common as barns. Airplanes, once fragile curiosities, grew into sturdy machines. Pilots like Charles Lindbergh captured the imagination by crossing oceans, while Amelia Earhart proved that women too could master the skies. In homes, refrigerators hummed where iceboxes had once stood, and radios turned isolated farms into connected listeners of the same songs and speeches. Modernity no longer belonged only to cities. It was reaching the countryside as well. The prosperity of the decade encouraged indulgence. Department stores dazzled with goods under glittering lights, their windows filled with mannequins dressed in the latest styles. Women bobbed their hair and shortened their skirts, declaring independence from old rules. Flappers smoked cigarettes in public, danced the Charleston in crowded halls, and laughed in the face of traditions that had confined their mothers. Jazz bands provided the soundtrack their horns and drums turning nightlife into a defiance of Victorian restraint. But Prohibition cast its own spell over the age. The ban on alcohol did not end drinking. It created a shadow economy that flourished beyond the reach of law. Speakeasies hid behind false doors, guarded by passwords whispered to doormen. Inside, bartenders poured bootleg whiskey, often dangerous but rarely refused. Organized crime built empires on this demand. Figures like Al Capone ruled Chicago with bribery and brutality, their power stretching from police stations to City Hall. Shootouts turned city streets into battlegrounds, and newspapers chronicled each gangland killing with a mix of horror and fascination. The Republic, intent on legislating morality, instead fueled corruption on a scale it could not control. Culture blossomed alongside chaos. In Harlem, a renaissance of art, music, and literature revealed the depth of African American creativity. Langston Hughes wrote poetry that carried the cadence of blues and the weight of history, declaring that his people were central to the nation's story. Zora Neale Hurston collected folklore, preserving the voices of communities too often ignored. On stage, Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong turned jazz into a global language, while painters and sculptors experimented with bold forms. Harlem pulsed as both a neighborhood and a symbol that out of struggle could rise brilliance. Hollywood, too, shaped the decade's imagination. Silent stars gave way to talkies, and theaters erupted with applause as voices filled the screen. Studios churned out melodramas, comedies, and musicals that transported audiences from everyday life into glittering worlds. Film stars became household names, their scandals and triumphs discussed as eagerly as political debates. Cinema united the country in shared experience, a dream projected in flickering light. Even sports heroes captured national adoration. Babe Ruth swung his bat with such power that baseball parks could scarcely contain the ball. Jack Dempsey filled arenas as boxing's heavyweight champion, while college football games drew crowds that rivaled political rallies. The heroes of the 1920s were not generals or presidents, but entertainers and athletes, symbols of an America that preferred spectacle to solemnity. Still, beneath the glamour, cracks spread quietly. Farmers faced falling crop prices, victims of overproduction and shrinking global markets. Debt mounted as they tried to keep pace with mechanized agriculture, and small-town banks trembled with each season's uncertainty. While brokers in New York toasted rising stocks, families in the Midwest watched their hopes wither like crops in a drought. The prosperity of the decade was uneven, though few wished to admit it. The illusion collapsed in a week of panic. On Wall Street, stock prices plunged. Crowds gathered outside banks, their faces anxious as rumors spread. Some investors lost fortunes in a day, others their life savings. Banks toppled in chains of failure, dragging businesses with them. The panic spread outward, shutting factories and emptying pay envelopes. The very symbols of the decade, skyscrapers, radios, automobiles, suddenly seemed mocking reminders of a confidence built on fragile ground. The Great Depression was not a single moment, but a relentless unraveling. Bread lines wound through city blocks, men in worn coats waiting for a ladle of soup. Women stretched meager rations, sewing and mending to keep children fed. Pride dissolved as families pawned heirlooms or knocked on neighbors' doors in desperation. Suicide rates climbed as hope evaporated. The land of plenty seemed barren overnight. Then came drought. On the Great Plains, soil turned to dust under scorching winds. Clouds darkened the sky, blotting out the sun. Children coughed in the grit, cattle suffocated, and farms vanished beneath shifting dunes. Families loaded possessions onto trucks, caravans heading west in search of survival. They followed rumors of work in California, only to find crowded camps and resentment. Photographers captured faces lined with exhaustion, images that became icons of endurance in an unforgiving land. Protest erupted in many forms. Unemployed men marched on state capitals, demanding relief. Veterans camped on the Mall in Washington, pleading for promised bonuses. Farmers blocked roads to prevent foreclosures. Songs, novels, and murals gave voice to the suffering, turning despair into collective memory. The nation, which had once danced in speakeasies and applauded jazz, now endured hunger and humiliation. Into this abyss stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His voice on the radio carried reassurance into darkened homes, promising that fear itself was the enemy. The New Deal he launched reshaped the role of government. Young men planted forests and built trails under the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Tennessee Valley Authority dammed rivers, bringing electricity to valleys where kerosene lamps had once flickered. The Works Progress Administration paved roads, painted murals, and employed writers to record oral histories. For the first time, federal power reached deeply into everyday life, binding citizens and state in new partnership. The New Deal did not end hardship completely, but it altered the nation's expectations. Government was no longer a distant arbiter. It became a presence, offering aid and demanding responsibility. Critics decried creeping socialism, but for millions, the programs meant survival. They also meant dignity, the chance to work, to earn, to stand rather than kneel. As the 1930s waned, recovery remained fragile. Yet beyond the Atlantic and Pacific, new dangers rose. Dictators marched in Europe and Asia, threatening to engulf the world in another storm. America, still scarred by its own ordeal, hesitated. But the lessons of the 20s and 30s, exuberance and collapse, drought and relief, had steeled the Republic. The next part of the United States story would demand sacrifice greater than any breadline or dust storm, for a conflict was coming that would test not just prosperity, but survival itself. Through the 1930s, most Americans wanted no part of foreign wars. The memory of trenches, poison gas, and the long casualty lists of the First World War remained raw. Congress passed neutrality laws, and voices on the radio urged staying clear of Europe's quarrels. But as fascism tightened its grip, indifference became harder to sustain. Nazi banners hung over Paris after the German conquest, and bombers pounded London. Refugees spoke of horrors, while President Franklin Roosevelt warned that dictators threatened not only Europe, but freedom itself. He pressed Congress to send arms to Britain and China under Lend-Lease, edging closer to involvement, even as isolationists resisted. The nation balanced on the edge of decision until an attack swept the choice away. On a quiet Sunday in December 1941, Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor. Bombs shattered battleships, torpedoes ripped through hulls, and flames leapt skyward. The Arizona sank with more than 1,000 sailors trapped inside, while plumes of smoke darkened the morning sky. By the time the planes turned back toward the Pacific, the United States had suffered a blow unlike any in its history. Roosevelt, his voice steady, though grief weighed every word, told Congress the day would live in infamy. Within hours, war was declared. The transformation was immediate. Young men crowded recruitment centers, some lying about their age to enlist. Factories that had been idle during the Depression roared with life. their machines turning out tanks, rifles, and bombers in endless streams. Women poured into shipyards and assembly lines, welding steel plates and riveting aircraft wings. Rosie the Riveter, with her rolled-up sleeve and determined gaze, became the emblem of their strength. Families rationed sugar, rubber, and gasoline. Children collected scrap metal. Neighborhoods planted victory gardens. Posters urged unity. Loose lips sink ships. We can do it. In a nation fractured by economic despair only years earlier, war forged a sense of collective mission. Troops deployed first to North Africa, where desert sands became battlefields. American soldiers, inexperienced at first, stumbled against hardened German units, but under commanders like Dwight D. Eisenhower, they learned quickly. Victory in Tunisia opened the way into Italy, where mountain passes and fortified towns slowed every advance. Rome eventually fell, yet the campaign was a grinding ordeal, teaching the cost of pushing the Axis back yard by yard. The decisive moment came with the invasion of France. Before dawn, an armada crossed the English Channel. Landing craft opened on beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Juno, and Sword. Waves of soldiers charged into machine gun fire, stumbling across sand littered with bodies. Some units were nearly annihilated, but by sheer persistence and sacrifice, a foothold was won. Normandy became the gateway to liberation. From there, Allied armies advanced through hedgerows, across rivers, and into towns where French civilians cheered beneath falling rubble. The German army did not collapse quietly. In the winter of 1944, it launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. Snow, fog, and bitter cold cloaked the Battle of the Bulge. American units surrounded at Bastogne refused to yield, answering demands for surrender with a single defiant word: nuts. The counterattack failed, leaving Germany's strength broken. In the months that followed, Allied forces crossed the Rhine, and Soviet armies advanced from the east. When camps like Auschwitz and Dachau were liberated, the world confronted crimes that words could scarcely capture. Emaciated survivors, piles of shoes and spectacles, gas chambers that revealed industrialized murder. While Europe burned, the Pacific War raged with equal ferocity. At Midway, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, turning the tide. From then on, US forces advanced island by island. Guadalcanal tested Marines in jungle swamps. Saipan and Leyte saw some of the largest naval battles in history. At Iwo Jima, Marines raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi after weeks of brutal combat, an image that captured sacrifice and resilience. Okinawa followed, costing tens of thousands of lives in a struggle that foreshadowed the unimaginable casualties of an invasion of Japan itself. Behind the lines, the home front bore its own contradictions. African Americans migrated north and west to fill industrial jobs, even as segregation and discrimination endured. The Double V campaign called for victory abroad and equality at home. Japanese Americans, many citizens, were forced into internment camps ringed with barbed wire, stripped of property and dignity by suspicion and fear. Women who had joined factories discovered that when peace returned, their jobs would be reclaimed by men. The war unified, but it also exposed injustices that would shape struggles for decades to come. Science added another dimension. In secret laboratories, physicists split the atom under the Manhattan Project. Their work culminated in weapons of unimaginable force. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Firestorms consumed cities. Tens of thousands died instantly, and survivors carried scars for life. Days later, Japan surrendered. The war that had begun with explosions at Pearl Harbor ended with destruction so vast it seemed beyond human comprehension. Roosevelt, who had steered the nation through depression and most of the war, did not live to see final victory. In April 1945, he died in Warm Springs, Georgia, his body exhausted by years of leadership. His successor, Harry Truman, bore the burden of final decisions. Under his hand, Germany surrendered in May, and Japan followed in August. Celebrations erupted, crowds thronged Times Square, soldiers kissed sweethearts, and parades filled city streets. For a moment, joy eclipsed the grief of 4 long years. The toll was staggering. More than 400,000 American lives lost, millions worldwide. Yet out of ashes rose a new order. The United Nations formed, a fragile hope for peace. The United States emerged with its economy stronger than any other. Its military stretched across the globe, its influence unmatched. The republic that had once hesitated to cross oceans now stood as a superpower, its destiny no longer confined to its shores. The war had begun with doubt and fear, with debates over whether America should involve itself at all. It ended with the nation transformed, carrying burdens and responsibilities it had never before imagined. Out of sacrifice and victory, the United States stepped into a new age, not as a reluctant participant, but as a leader whose choices would shape the world to come. Crowds gathered at a Montgomery bus stop as a quiet seamstress refused to surrender her seat. Her act of defiance, simple yet profound, signaled that the struggle for freedom at home would unfold alongside America's contest with the Soviet Union abroad. Rosa Parks' arrest in 1955 sparked a boycott that lasted more than a year, propelling Martin Luther King Jr. into national prominence and announcing that the promises of liberty would be tested not only in foreign policy, but on American streets. While buses rolled half-empty in Alabama, the nation's leaders stared across oceans toward an adversary armed with nuclear weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union circled each other warily, their rivalry shaping every decision, every fear. Truman had already pledged aid to nations resisting communism, and billions in the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's shattered economies. NATO bound America to Western allies, while the Soviets tightened control over Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain divided the continent, and with it, the world. The Cold War turned hot in Korea. North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, driving Southern defenders back until American troops joined under a United Nations banner. General Douglas MacArthur's audacious landing at Incheon reversed the tide, but Chinese intervention plunged the war into bloody stalemate. Soldiers froze in trenches, their battles ending where they had begun. When an armistice halted the conflict, the peninsula remained divided, and the war's toll was counted in lives rather than territory gained. Back home, suspicion and paranoia seeped into daily life. Senator Joseph McCarthy waved papers on live television, claiming he held lists of communists embedded in government and society. Hearings dragged teachers, actors, and officials before committees, demanding they prove loyalty. Careers ended with a whisper of accusation. Families gathered around televisions to watch, caught between fear and disbelief. McCarthy's power collapsed when his bullying tactics were exposed, but the damage lingered, a scar of mistrust etched into the culture. Not all news was grim. Prosperity flourished. Suburbs spread across farmland, rows of nearly identical houses promising comfort for veterans and their families. The baby boom filled schools with children, while highways carried commuters to offices and shoppers to gleaming malls. Television sets multiplied, bringing sitcoms and news anchors into living rooms. For the first time, a shared national culture flickered on screens coast to coast. Even as families watched I Love Lucy, the struggle for equality pressed forward. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education declared segregated schools unconstitutional, igniting fierce resistance in the South. Federal troops escorted 9 black students into Little Rock High School, facing jeers and threats from angry crowds. Each step they took was a battle in itself, proof that the Cold War's rhetoric of freedom abroad rang hollow if liberty was denied at home. Meanwhile, rivalry extended beyond Earth's atmosphere. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 shocked Americans, a beeping signal circling overhead that seemed to prove communism's scientific edge. Panic spurred investment in education and research, and within years, NASA was born. The space race became a new front in the Cold War. Each launch and orbit, both a technological triumph and a veiled reminder of the rockets capable of carrying nuclear warheads. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon in 1969, it symbolized more than exploration. It was a declaration of leadership, visible to the entire world. The 1960s magnified both promise and peril. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution allied with Moscow, and US attempts to overthrow him failed at the Bay of Pigs. Soon after, spy planes photographed nuclear missile sites under construction. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. Soviet ships steamed toward confrontation. Only a last-minute agreement, removing missiles from Cuba in exchange for secret concessions in Turkey, pulled humanity back from the brink. At the same time, Vietnam became America's quagmire. What began as advisors supporting a fragile government escalated into a war involving 500,000 American soldiers. Helicopters ferried troops into jungles where guerrilla fighters vanished like shadows. Napalm scarred landscapes, villages burned, and casualty lists lengthened. At home, protests grew louder. Students filled campuses with chants. Draft cards were burned, and music turned into protest. The war divided the nation, pitting generations against each other, and faith in government faltered as leaders promised victory that never came. Domestic struggles broadened beyond civil rights. The women's movement demanded equality in workplaces and law, pressing for recognition long deferred. Native American activists staged occupations, demanding respect for treaties ignored for centuries. Environmentalists warned that rivers fouled by industry and air choked with smog threatened the nation's health. In marches, lawsuits, and lobbying, Americans insisted democracy expand to include voices too long excluded. Even the presidency itself was shaken. Richard Nixon, who opened relations with China and pursued détente with the Soviet Union, resigned in disgrace after the Watergate scandal revealed corruption at the highest levels. Televised hearings exposed lies, tapes confirmed guilt, and public trust in leaders plunged. The Cold War continued, but Americans learned that dangers could come not only from distant rivals, but from within their own institutions. By the mid-1970s, the United States had traveled a path of triumphs and traumas. It had stared down nuclear brinkmanship, placed men on the moon, and passed laws that outlawed segregation. It had also endured assassinations, riots, scandals, and a war that tore its confidence apart. The Cold War endured, stretching from Berlin to Saigon, but the deeper struggle was within, to prove that democracy could remain resilient under pressure, and that the ideals promised in founding documents could be extended to all. Ronald Reagan took office with a smile and a promise that it was morning in America. His optimism cut against the gloom of inflation, gas shortages, and doubt left by Vietnam and Watergate. He championed free enterprise, cut taxes, and pushed deregulation, declaring that government too often strangled opportunity. To many, his words felt like sunlight after years of clouds. His presidency became known as a conservative revolution, one that reshaped politics for a generation. At home, the 1980s brimmed with both confidence and excess. Suburbs sprawled wider, shopping malls became cultural hubs, and Wall Street roared with ambition. The term yuppie, young urban professional, captured a new ethos of cell phones, designer suits, and relentless pursuit of wealth. MTV filled screens with music videos that fused fashion, rebellion, and consumerism into a single stream of influence. Personal computers began to slip into homes, hinting at a digital future not yet fully understood. It was a decade of spectacle and profit, but also widening inequality as prosperity left entire communities behind. Abroad, Reagan staked his presidency on standing firm against the Soviet Union. He announced a massive military buildup and unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to shield America from missiles with futuristic technology that critics dubbed Star Wars. His rhetoric branded the USSR an evil empire, words that electrified supporters and alarmed skeptics. Nuclear arsenals expanded, and the arms race reached heights unseen since the early Cold War. Yet behind the fiery words, diplomacy stirred. Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in icy Geneva, in Reykjavik, and later in Washington. They clashed, argued, then shook hands on agreements that cut entire classes of nuclear weapons. Change swept faster in the East than anyone expected. Gorbachev's reforms loosened the Soviet grip, and satellite states began to slip away. In Poland, workers organized under solidarity. In Hungary, borders opened. In Czechoslovakia, crowds filled squares demanding freedom. The climax came in Berlin. Crowds scaled the wall that had split the city for nearly 3 decades, hammering at concrete, dancing on its crumbling top. East German guards, uncertain and overwhelmed, let people pour through. The wall fell, not with a single explosion, but with thousands of ordinary citizens chipping away at its tyranny. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended not with apocalyptic fire, but with implosion, leaving the United States alone as a global superpower. The triumph stirred pride, but also uncertainty. What was America's role without a rival? The first answer came from the Middle East. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush assembled a coalition of nations and launched Operation Desert Storm. Bombs lit Baghdad's night sky on live television, while tanks and troops drove Iraqi forces from Kuwait in weeks. The swift victory restored faith in military power and seemed to prove that American leadership could marshal global consensus. Yet it also revealed the deep entanglements of oil, religion, and politics in the region, entanglements that would only grow. At home, the 1990s unfolded in a different key. The Cold War's end brought budget surpluses, and globalization surged. Trade agreements like NAFTA linked economies across borders, while cargo ships and airlines moved goods with unprecedented speed. Silicon Valley erupted with innovation. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and later Amazon and Google redefined work, communication, and culture. The internet crept from universities into homes, its dial-up tone a herald of transformation. For many, the decade felt like prosperity secured at last. Bill Clinton's presidency embodied the contradictions of the era. Charismatic and skilled at communication, he presided over economic growth and technological change. His administration expanded trade, balanced budgets, and claimed to modernize liberalism for a new century. Yet scandal followed him, culminating in impeachment over personal misconduct. Though acquitted, the episode revealed how bitter partisanship had become, foreshadowing divisions that would deepen in years ahead. Culturally, the United States projected influence as never before. Hollywood films dominated box offices worldwide. American pop stars filled stadiums from Tokyo to Johannesburg, and fast food franchises dotted every corner of the globe. The country's cultural exports shaped tastes and lifestyles across continents, making America not just a military and economic power, but a cultural one as well. Beneath the prosperity, shadows lengthened. Terrorism emerged as a growing threat. In 1993, a truck bomb shook the World Trade Center, killing 6 and signaling that America itself was a target. In 1998, bombings struck U.S. embassies in Africa. 2 years later, the USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. These assaults were seen as distant tragedies by many Americans, but they revealed networks that would soon bring violence to the homeland. The new millennium arrived with anticipation and anxiety. The Y2K bug that some feared would cripple computers passed quietly. The dot-com bubble burst, wiping out fortunes but leaving behind a digital infrastructure that would shape the future. The 2000 presidential election dragged through recounts and court battles, ending in razor-thin margins that underscored a nation divided. America entered the 21st century, both confident in its power and uncertain of its unity. Then came September 11th, 2001. A morning sky over New York turned into fire and ash as hijacked planes tore into the World Trade Center. Another struck the Pentagon, while a fourth crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. Towers collapsed, dust engulfed Manhattan, and nearly 3,000 lives were lost. Television broadcast the horror in real time, searing it into memory. The illusion of invulnerability vanished. Grief turned to resolve, and within weeks, American troops entered Afghanistan to dismantle the networks responsible. From Reagan's rallying cry of "Morning in America" to the smoke over Manhattan, the United States had traveled through triumph and upheaval. It had ended the Cold War, presided over globalization and technological revolution, and wielded unrivaled influence. Yet the attacks revealed that even the lone superpower could be struck at its heart. A new century had begun, not with celebration, but with fire, and the nation stood once more at a crossroads, uncertain of what challenges lay ahead, but certain that they would be profound. At the close of the 20th century, the United States stood taller than any nation in living memory. The Cold War had ended with its rival dissolved, and what remained was a republic unmatched in wealth, technology, and influence. Its economy surged with invention. Its culture filled the airwaves of the planet, and its armed forces circled the globe. To many, it seemed that history itself had conspired to place America at the summit of the age. The new prosperity announced itself in homes and streets alike. Suburbs spread outward from every city, filled with cul-de-sacs, chain restaurants, and big-box stores. Highways hummed with minivans and SUVs, while airports expanded to accommodate record numbers of travelers. Cable television offered hundreds of channels, while the glow of computer screens began to light bedrooms and offices. Internet service screeched to life through dial-up connections, delivering email and chat rooms that shrank the world into something intimate and immediate. For those who remembered ration books and bread lines, this abundance felt like living proof that the centuries' sacrifices had been rewarded. Silicon Valley became the forge of this new world. Young engineers and entrepreneurs turned code into companies, some collapsing as quickly as they rose, others growing into empires. Personal computers transformed desks, laptops spilled into classrooms. Mobile phones, once clunky bricks, grew sleeker until they slipped into pockets. The dot-com boom promised limitless riches, and although it burst at decade's end, the infrastructure remained. Servers, networks, and habits that would define the century to come. America's new frontier was not land, but information, and it was no less transformative than the conquest of prairies or the building of railroads. Globalization carried American influence farther than armies ever could. Cargo ships stacked with containers crossed oceans with ease, their holds filled with electronics, textiles, and food that blurred the lines between nations. Trade agreements stitched economies together, allowing capital to flow across borders in seconds. Fast food franchises spread into distant capitals, pop stars filled stadiums on multiple continents, and Hollywood's blockbusters played in languages from Mandarin to Arabic. Jeans, sneakers, and soft drinks became common symbols from Nairobi to Moscow. For admirers, this was proof of America's cultural power. For critics, it was homogenization, a steamroller flattening traditions. Everywhere, contradictions appeared. Wall Street soared, its trading floors crowded with brokers shouting into phones. But shuttered factories in the Midwest revealed another truth. Jobs once steady had fled overseas. Urban skylines gleamed with glass towers, while rural communities struggled with declining populations. Prosperity was real, but uneven, and even amid triumph, a quiet anxiety stirred about who was included and who was left behind. Politics reflected these tensions. Leaders spoke of a new world order and the dividends of peace, but partisanship deepened. The impeachment of a president after personal scandal demonstrated how rancor could overshadow even prosperity. Cable news aired partisan battles around the clock, magnifying divisions. On one hand, optimism reigned, unemployment low, budgets balanced, the stock market soaring. On the other, trust in institutions faltered as Americans wondered whether their leaders could rise above bitterness. Still, the broader mood leaned toward confidence. The United States commanded not only markets, but imagination. Its military, unrivaled, patrolled sea lanes and skies, enforcing security far from home. Its currency served as the bedrock of global trade. Its scientists launched telescopes that captured images of galaxies. Its athletes drew millions of viewers. Its authors and filmmakers set the pace of global storytelling. The reach of this single nation seemed limitless, stretching from orbiting satellites to the clothing worn by children across the globe. Daily life mirrored both triumph and uncertainty. Malls became temples of consumerism, while online retailers hinted at a future where shopping would no longer require leaving home. Schools taught children to type as well as to write, their assignments increasingly drawn from glowing screens. Air travel turned international exchange into routine, but also heightened awareness that the world's crises were never far away. Immigration enriched cities with new languages and foods, reshaping culture even as debates over borders sharpened. America was at once confident in its role as global leader and restless about what that role demanded. The millennium's arrival crystallized this duality. The feared collapse of computers at midnight, the Y2K bug, proved anticlimactic, but it underscored how thoroughly society had come to depend on technology. Fireworks erupted over skylines, celebrations filled time zones in sequence, and Americans cheered the dawn of the 21st century as if it were theirs to command. It seemed the Republic had conquered the century behind it and was poised to master the one ahead. But shadows lingered even amid fireworks. Terrorist plots abroad had already struck embassies and warships. warning that distant enemies might reach across oceans. Financial markets trembled with volatility as the dot-com bubble collapsed, erasing fortunes overnight. Diseases crossed borders faster than ever before, hinting that globalization carried risks as well as rewards. These were not yet defining crises, but their outlines lay on the horizon, reminders that no triumph lasts forever. To stand at the end of the 20th century was to look back at an extraordinary arc. A republic born of rebellion had expanded across a continent, torn itself apart in civil war, risen through industrial might, and endured 2 world wars. It had confronted depression, led allies to victory against fascism, and outlasted a rival superpower in a contest of decades. It had become the indispensable nation, its choices shaping the fates of others far from its borders. But it was also a country still searching to reconcile ideals with reality, liberty with inequality, wealth with poverty, confidence with humility. America at the millennium was both triumph and question. It was the giant of its century, towering above rivals, shaping culture and commerce with unrivaled force. Yet even as it stood dominant, it faced the same challenge that had haunted it since the beginning: how to live up to the promises set down in its founding words. Behind it stretched centuries of struggle. Before it lay the unknown. On the threshold of a new era, the Republic stood like a colossus, its head lifted toward the future, its past heavy at its feet. The 20th century had crowned it with power, but destiny remained unwritten. The next chapter, like those before, would demand sacrifice, imagination, and courage. America's story was not finished. It had only reached its latest turning point.